Nobody in wrestling history divides fans quite like Vince Russo. To some, he was a visionary who dared to think outside the box, dragging wrestling into the modern age with shocking swerves and edgy storylines. To others, he was the reckless writer who nearly destroyed the business he claimed to love. But no matter what side you stand on, one truth remains undeniable. Vince Russo made enemies everywhere he went, and the rivalries he sparked behind the curtain were often far more intense than anything fans ever saw inside the ring. The wrestling world was changing fast in the late 1990s. On one side, the WWF was riding high on the Attitude Era, with Stone Cold Steve Austin flipping off his boss, The Rock electrifying arenas, and edgy content drawing record ratings. On the other side, WCW was still thriving with the NWO and larger-than-life icons like Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. Russo had built his name in the WWF as a writer who embraced chaos, but when he arrived in WCW, he quickly discovered that his style clashed with the egos of wrestlers who believed they were bigger than the business itself. One of his earliest and perhaps most heated battles was with a man who seemed unstoppable, Bill Goldberg. Goldberg was no ordinary wrestler. With his black trunks, bald head, and explosive power, he became a phenomenon, going undefeated in 174 consecutive matches. To the fans, he was a modern-day gladiator, the ultimate hero who destroyed every opponent in his path. To the children who idolized him, Goldberg was more than a wrestler. He was a role model. But to Vince Russo, there was a problem. The streak was over, and once that historic run had ended, he believed Goldberg had nowhere else to go. Russo thought the only way forward was to turn Goldberg into something he never wanted to be, a villain. For Russo, it was simple logic. A hero can only win so many times before the story grows stale. In his mind, the natural twist was to take Goldberg, the most beloved babyface in WCW, and shock the world by turning him into a monster heel. But Goldberg wasn't just playing a role, he was Goldberg. His name wasn't a character, it was his real identity. When kids saw him, they didn't see an actor pretending to be a superhero, they saw the man himself. To betray that image felt unthinkable to him. And so, when Russo pitched the heel turn, Goldberg pushed back harder than anyone ever had. Russo didn't understand at first. To him, wrestling was entertainment, a television show no different than a movie or drama series. He pointed out that Goldberg had played villains in films, even reminding him of his role in Santa's sleigh. If he could play a bad guy in Hollywood, why couldn't he do the same on Nitro? But Goldberg's answer was simple, and it struck Russo deeply. In the movies, I'm a character. On this show, I am Goldberg. Kids see me, and they believe I'm real. I can't betray that. The standoff between writer and wrestler turned bitter. Goldberg resisted the idea with every fiber of his being, but Russo was the boss, and eventually, the turn went ahead. Yet once Goldberg agreed on paper, the tension didn't fade, it only grew worse. During one infamous segment, Goldberg was supposed to spear Russo through a cage. It was a dangerous stunt, but both men had agreed on how it should happen. Russo, already nursing a concussion from earlier injuries, begged Goldberg to take care of him. He reminded him over and over, "Bill, I've got a concussion. You've got to protect me here." Goldberg reassured him, promising he'd land him safely between two barricades. But when the moment came, everything went wrong. Goldberg didn't place Russo gently between the rails, he drove him headfirst into the steel. The impact was brutal, knocking Russo out cold. Instead of the carefully planned stunt, it looked and felt like an execution. Russo would later admit he couldn't even confront Goldberg afterward because he was stretchered out, dazed and battered. He believed Goldberg had done it deliberately, fueled by the resentment he carried for being forced into a role he never wanted. The image of Russo lying unconscious while Goldberg stood tall blurred the lines between storyline and reality. Was it an accident? Was it revenge? To this day, Russo refuses to accuse Goldberg outright, but he never forgot the betrayal he felt in that moment. Behind the curtain, the two men were oil and water, one obsessed with entertainment, the other determined to protect his authenticity. That clash of visions left scars that would never truly heal. Yet Goldberg wasn't the only superstar who found himself at war with Vince Russo. If his battles with the powerhouse were about honor and image, his next feud would be about something far greater: power, pride, and legacy. It was a clash with the biggest name in wrestling history, a man who refused to step aside for anyone, Hulk Hogan. And unlike Goldberg, this feud wouldn't just play out in the ring. It would explode in court, in front of millions of fans, and change the trajectory of WCW forever. When Vince Russo first set foot in WCW in late 1999, the tension was already thick. He could feel eyes burning into him the moment he walked backstage, and none more piercing than those of Hulk Hogan. Hogan wasn't just a wrestler, he was wrestling. For nearly 2 decades, he had been the face of the industry, the immortal icon who slammed giants and preached, "Say your prayers and eat your vitamins." But beneath the tan, the bandana, and the charisma, Hogan was a master politician, a man who protected his spot at the top with an iron grip. And when Russo arrived with his wild ideas and reputation for pushing younger talent, Hogan immediately saw him as a threat. Russo's vision was clear. The stars of yesterday couldn't carry the company forever. Ric Flair and Hogan were aging, and WCW desperately needed new blood. To Russo, elevating mid-carders and building fresh faces was the only way to survive the wrestling war with WWF. But to Hogan, those words were poison. He believed his name still drew money, that his mere presence could fill arenas, and he had the contract clause to prove it: creative control. It meant that no matter what Russo wrote, Hogan could veto any storyline that didn't protect his image. The first sparks of conflict came in whispers and sideways glances, but they grew louder with every show. Russo heard rumors that Hogan believed he was being phased out, that Russo's entire mission was to bury the veterans and hand the spotlight to the new generation. Russo insisted this wasn't true. He wanted balance, legends guiding the young stars, but perception was everything. And in Hogan's eyes, Russo was an enemy moving against him. The breaking point came at Bash at the Beach 2000, one of the most infamous nights in wrestling history. Hogan was scheduled to face Jeff Jarrett, with Russo's script calling for Jarrett to lay down in the middle of the ring, handing Hogan a meaningless victory to highlight how selfish his creative control had become. Russo's plan was then to strip Hogan of the belt and crown a new champion later in the night, symbolically moving WCW beyond the shadow of its aging star. But Hogan wasn't having it. Backstage, he flexed his creative muscle, refusing to go along with the finish as planned. What happened next blurred reality and storyline so perfectly that fans still debate it today. As Jarrett laid down in the ring, Hogan, visibly annoyed, put a boot on his chest and pinned him. The match was over in seconds, but the story was far from finished. Moments later, Vince Russo stormed out, his voice dripping with venom as he grabbed the microphone. In a promo that felt more like a confession than a script, Russo tore Hogan apart in front of a live pay-per-view audience. He called him selfish. He called him a politician. He called him a man who cared more about protecting his ego than saving the company. And then he said the words no one expected. "As far as I'm concerned, Hulk Hogan can kiss my ass." With that, he declared Hogan was fired. The wrestling world was stunned. Was this real? Was it scripted? Or was Russo truly cutting ties with the most famous wrestler in history? Hogan thought it was real enough. Outraged and humiliated, he walked out of WCW for good and launched a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Russo and Turner Broadcasting. He claimed the promo had damaged his reputation, breaking the terms of his contract. For years, the case dragged on, only to be dismissed in 2003 when the judge ruled that Russo's rant was part of the show. But the damage was done. Hogan never returned to WCW, and the company itself collapsed just months later. To fans, it looked like Russo had finally slain the dragon. He had dared to say out loud what many believed, that Hulk Hogan's stranglehold on WCW was choking the life out of the company. But behind the curtain, the fallout was chaos. Russo was now branded as reckless, a man willing to set fire to bridges for the sake of shock value. And if his war with Hogan burned bright, his next battle would smolder even deeper because it involved Hogan's closest ally, Eric Bischoff. Bischoff had been the mastermind behind WCW's rise, the architect of Monday Nitro and the NWO. But by 2000, his vision had run dry, and he returned to the company alongside Russo in a last-ditch effort to save it. On paper, the partnership looked promising. Russo, with his edgy, unpredictable writing, and Bischoff with his business mind and connections. But in reality, they were oil and water. Russo thrived on chaos, Bischoff thrived on control. Their philosophies clashed at every turn, and with Hogan at Bischoff's side, Russo's path grew darker with every step. Russo believed in getting his hands dirty, working side by side with the wrestlers and treating them as equals. Bischoff, in Russo's eyes, was the opposite, driven by money, power, and ego, treating people like pawns on a chessboard. The respect that Russo craved was absent, replaced instead with hostility. Meetings turned into shouting matches, and creative sessions became battlefields. The Bash at the Beach incident was the final straw for Bischoff, who soon walked away from WCW entirely. Russo was left behind in the wreckage of a company spiraling out of control. When WCW finally collapsed in 2001, many fans pointed fingers at Vince Russo, blaming his chaotic writing and backstage feuds for hastening the company's death. But in Russo's eyes, he had simply tried to modernize a company suffocated by egos that refused to step aside. The truth, as always in wrestling, was more complicated. And while his wars with Goldberg, Hogan, and Bischoff scarred his reputation forever, there was still one feud that cut him deeper than all the rest, because it wasn't just business, it was personal. That feud was with Jeff Jarrett, a man who had once been like family to him. What began as trust and friendship would unravel into betrayal, bitterness, and a violent clash that blurred the line between storyline and reality in ways Russo could never have imagined. By the time Vince Russo left WCW behind, his reputation was scorched. He had survived bitter wars with Goldberg, Hogan, and Bischoff, but the toll was heavy. And yet, despite the chaos, one man remained in his corner, Jeff Jarrett. They had forged a bond years earlier in WWF, and Russo had stood by him when others didn't believe in his star power. In WCW, Russo even made Jarrett a world champion, seeing in him a credibility that few others acknowledged. For a time, their loyalties seemed unshakable. But in wrestling, alliances are fragile, and even the strongest friendships can collapse under the weight of ego, politics, and betrayal. When TNA Wrestling was born in 2002, Jarrett was at the center of it all. With the backing of his father Jerry and later Dixie Carter's family money, Jarrett envisioned a new company that could fill the void left by WCW. Russo was there from the beginning, crafting storylines and injecting the unpredictable chaos that had made him both famous and infamous. Together, they dreamed of building something lasting, a company that could stand against WWE. But cracks began to show almost immediately, and Russo soon realized he was caught in the middle of a war he never asked for. The first problem wasn't Jeff, but Jerry Jarrett. Jerry despised Russo's style of booking. To him, wrestling was sacred, rooted in tradition, athletic storytelling, and realism. Russo's crash TV approach, with swerves, shocking twists, and unpredictable angles, felt like an insult to everything Jerry had built his career on. He even mocked Russo publicly, comparing his writing to something scribbled on LSD. For Russo, the insults cut deep, but what hurt more was Jeff's silence. Instead of defending the man who had been his ally, Jeff often stayed quiet, leaving Russo to feel isolated and unwanted. Still, Russo tried to swallow his pride and press on. But the unease turned violent during a storyline that paired Russo and Jeff in a street fight. Russo had criticized the way some wrestlers threw punches on TV, claiming they looked fake and made the product weaker. Jeff took the comments personally. During the supposed match, instead of pulling his strikes, Jeff unleashed real blows. Russo went home bruised from head to toe, his body battered by a man he thought was his brother in arms. To him, it wasn't just a work. It was a message, one that screamed that the bond they once had was gone. The betrayal deepened years later when personal lives bled into business. In 2009, Jeff began a relationship with Karen Angle, the estranged wife of Kurt Angle, one of TNA's top stars. The locker room buzzed with rumors, and Dixie Carter, now the owner of TNA, asked Russo if he knew anything. He followed her instructions carefully, only report something if it directly threatened the company. Believing he was staying loyal, he kept quiet, but when the relationship came to light, Jeff denied it, and Dixie blamed Russo for not exposing the truth sooner. Once again, Russo was left as the scapegoat, caught between his boss and his friend. What hurt most wasn't the company politics. It was Jeff himself. Russo later said that after nearly 2 decades of friendship, Jarrett stopped talking to him. Instead of confronting him directly, instead of asking for clarity, Jeff simply cut him off, believing Dixie's version of events. To Russo, it was the ultimate betrayal. "After 20 years, you mean to tell me you won't even have a conversation with me?" he later said. That silence, more than any storyline, more than any creative dispute, broke him in ways Hogan and Bischoff never could. Russo's time in TNA ended in frustration. He felt burned out, trapped between egos and politics, unable to regain control of the product he once helped shape. His wars with Hogan and Bischoff had repeated themselves in a new company, with the same bitter ending, Russo walking away disillusioned. And his bond with Jarrett, once the one friendship that seemed unbreakable, was left in ruins. In his eyes, the business had swallowed another relationship whole, leaving only scars where trust once lived. Looking back, Russo remains one of the most polarizing figures in wrestling history. To his supporters, he was bold, innovative, and unafraid to challenge sacred traditions. To his critics, he was reckless, obsessed with shock value, and blind to the damage his style left behind. But one thing is certain, wherever Russo went, conflict followed. He clashed with icons, toppled legends, and redefined what it meant to be a villain, not just on screen, but behind the curtain. And yet, the story of Vince Russo leaves us with a lingering mystery. Was he truly the misunderstood genius who pushed wrestling forward only to be crushed by egos unwilling to let go of the past? Or was he the chaotic force who lit too many fires, burning every bridge he ever crossed until there was nothing left but ashes? The answer depends on who you ask. But here's the question I'll leave you with. If Russo had never turned on Goldberg, never clashed with Hogan, never lost Jarrett's friendship, would wrestling history look different today? Or was his destiny always to be the villain in someone else's story?